Jean, this dream's where you belong.
Second bio portion. This is early adulthood to On the Road. Late 1942, Jack meets Ralph Flanagan. Too high, huh? Ralph Flanagan is going to be an inspiration for him because this is the guy that's going to introduce him to every single one of those jazz musicians throughout his life. So anyways, in 1942, he joins the U.S. Merchant Marines and writes his first book, The Sea Is My Brother. Early in 1943, he leaves the U.S. Merchant Marines and in early 43 joins the U.S. Navy, only to serve 8 days. 8 days of active duty. Before arriving on the sick list, he had asked for aspirin for his headaches and was diagnosed by the medic of having a little bit of dementia. Anyways, Jack's response to that was, I just can't stand it. I like being by myself. So anyways, the day 10, he was honorably discharged on psychiatric grounds, and the medical examiner said that he had an indifferent character, or possibly schizoid personality disorder. Jack's response to that is, who cares? Also in that year, he finishes early stories and other writings atop on the underworld. 1944, he begins Orpheus Emerged, which is a novella. 1944, he's also arrested as a material witness in the murder of David Kimmerer of St. Louis in Central Park. What is a material witness? Anybody know? Somebody with direct knowledge of a crime. Anyways, he did have direct knowledge of a crime. His friend Lucian Carr, who he was introduced to a few years back, turned to Jack to help him out. And the situation is that Jack agrees and says, yeah, I'll dispose of the knife and all the other evidence for you. And so anyways, they go to William S. Burroughs and they say, hey, we're in a little bit of a pickle here. You want to help us out? And William Burroughs said, no, not really, but why don't you turn yourself in? So what did they do? They turned themselves in. So he calls on his father, Leo, and says, can you bail me out? And his father said, no. No, thank you, I can't do that. So he calls his girlfriend that he's living with, Edie Parker, and he says, can you bail me out? Anyways, there's a conflicting story on this, but they say it was bail out for marriage or marriage for money. I don't know which is true, but those are the two stories, and they're sticking to it. Anyways, Edie bails Jack out, and that night they marry at the courthouse in New York City. And in the same period of time, his parents moved to Ozone Park. He's back and forth between staying with his mother and father and staying with Edie. In 1945, he writes, and the hippos were boiled in their tanks with William S. Burroughs. Same time, his marriage is annulled to Edie. He moves to Ozone Park, which is a neighborhood in Queens, moves in with his parents, and begins to write The Town and the City, He finishes the Orpheus Emerged. In 1946, he rewrites The Town and the City. Now, the claim that a lot of people say is the man only wrote things once, if you've seen it. The reality is that he was an avid rewriter. He rewrote everything. And I would say some of the poetry that Dan read was probably written at least 9 or 10 times. That's what he averaged on a rewrite. So anyways, he rewrites The Town and the City, and then is coined Wizard of Ozone Park by a number of his neighbors. He'd be out wandering around with his Colt 45 and his bourbon or whiskey, roaming the streets, writing things down, just as Dan had mentioned, with a pocket and a pen and a notebook. 1947, he starts on the road, and it's first noted as The Beat Generation. That was the original title. And he and Neal Cassady begin their essentially 5-year journey and road trip, and they drive across the U.S. and Mexico. And then he starts, in this process, he's also writing, starts The Windblown World. He falls in love with Mexico. And at the same time, who's living in Mexico but William S. Burroughs and Joan? And so, of course, he has places to stay. And then he starts, when he's in the Northern California, he starts a real interest in Eastern philosophy. He hasn't quite grasped it, but he's getting an idea of it, and it's something new for him. Anyway, it's a religious and philosophical adventure. And in 1948, he restarts on the road, and he calls it Road Trip Adventures. So he gets rid of that whole generation nonsense and calls it a road trip adventure. And Neal said, well, that's a stupid name. It's obvious. It's too obvious. So anyways, this same period of time, 1948, he meets Robert Giraud, who I would say at this particular point in time was the most experimental of the publicists that were out there. He was willing to touch anybody that everybody else threw away. And joined 2 other men and started their own firm. And this is one of the things that Jack had a problem with was he loved Robert Giraud, but Robert Giraud edited 400 pages out of On the Road. And he said, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. And he said, well, I can do anything I want. And they absolutely became fast friends because he stood up to Jack, and Jack liked that in people. I think during this period of time in Ozone Park and then in certain areas in San Francisco, he would go to these bars and purposely start a fight just to see what would come of it. You know, a few broken ribs, a lost tooth, a couple black eyes, not a big deal. But who am I drinking with? Am I drinking with men? What am I drinking with? Fools? I mean, it was I don't necessarily know if we could call it a game, but we could definitely call it a point of interest. Anyhow, this is a quote from Robert Giroux. No, actually, this is a quote that Robert scribbled down in his book that was quoted from Jack. There shall not be any editing of this manuscript. This manuscript was dictated by the Holy Ghost. So in 1949, after all of this revision and 400 pages being removed, and this also occurred with the town and the city as well. He renames Road Trip Adventures to On the Road. And also, at this point in time, marries Joan Haverty. And in 1950, The Town and the City, which is the first book that is published, is finally published in 1950, and it's published as John Kerouac as opposed to Jack Kerouac. In 1951, he moves to West 20th in Manhattan and finishes On the Road and starts to write Visions of Cody, starts The Pick, and publishes and writes a couple of French novellas that were published in Quebec. And he begins to... Now, this is the first time the man takes a job. And he works as a railroad brakesman and a fire outlook. And the reason why he took the job, because he needed to collect money so he could get some other books published. And it also would give him an East-West American experience. Like Dan was talking about hopping trains, this was his adventure of hopping on a train and getting paid for it. At this particular point in time, he begins to travel throughout the U.S. and Mexico again. He meets Zoot Sims, Al Cohn, Mose Allison, and Stan Getz. And again, these are friends for life. They drank together and they shared women. And of course, their passion for music. And at this particular point in time, Joan leaves Jack while she's pregnant and says, "I'm done with this. You're out of your mind." And on February 16th, 1952, Janet Michelle, or Jan Kerouac, is born in Albany, New York. I'm sorry? And at this point in time, he writes the Legend of Duluth and publishes it. Now, this is what Jack considers his life's work. All the other stuff was really nonsense, but this was his life's work. He writes Dr. Sachs, writes the Book of Dreams, starts the Book of Sketches, and that's where I'm going to leave you off. And we're going to... do we have our visitor?
No, we don't have anyone.
Okay. Then leave you off, and that's Peter.
Tis young, this dream's where you belong.